Good morning and welcome to worship today, Sunday, August 2nd. The passage for this morning is from Matthew, and it's a remarkable passage. It's found in all four Gospels and twice in Matthew and Mark. No other story is like it in that regard. Remember, two of the Gospels have birth stories. Only one has the story of Lazarus being raised from the grave. Only one has the prodigal son. But the story I'm about to read is in all four Gospels, and it's repeated in two for a total of 6 times. Hear now this story from Matthew chapter 14. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, and he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is late. Send the crowds away so they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." And then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Here ends the story of our tradition. May we be given new hearts, minds, and ears for understanding. An English teacher and her class were studying well-known proverbs. One day she gave them a test to see how well they were understanding what she taught. She would state the first half of the proverb and then ask the students to come up with the rest of what it said. These were some of the answers the teacher got. It's always darkest before daylight savings time. Never underestimate the power of termites. Don't bite the hand that looks dirty. If you lie down with dogs, you'll stink in the morning. An idle mind is the best way to relax. A penny saved is not much. At first you don't succeed, get new batteries. Now, even though the students in that class had studied those parables for several days, they still had trouble with the right answers. And even when Jesus' disciples had been with him for several months, they still had trouble with getting their answer right. So in today's reading that I just read, it's late in the day, the disciples are on a hill out in the middle of nowhere, and they've got a bunch of hungry people on their hands. The disciples are practical, and so they suggest to Jesus that he send the people home so they can buy their own food. That, of course, was impossible. For one thing, most were poor and sick and homeless, or else they wouldn't have been out there following Jesus in the first place. The disciples were thinking out of a theology of scarcity. We don't have enough to go around. We can't feed all those people with our meager provisions. Somewhat similar to the comments we hear so frequently today, that America can no longer afford to care for its poor, much less all those left unemployed or furloughed amidst the pandemic. As some in Washington said this week, if we continue to pay out unemployment benefits, people won't want to return to work. And even though we are the richest country in the world, we simply can't afford to distribute the underserved with food stamps or WIC or school lunch programs or the earned income credit. Some argue we shouldn't even fund Head Start. During the pandemic, when thousands have lost their jobs, their livelihoods, we hear from government leaders, people just need to get out there and look for something new. They don't need another stimulus check. Jesus, on the other hand, had a theology of abundance. Share what you have because you have enough. Now, this story speaks to one of Jesus' most important messages, and that's justice. This is not the justice about punishment for wrongs done. Jesus isn't concerned about that kind of justice. Jesus isn't concerned about revenge. Punishment is our human obsession. The feeding of the 5,000 is about justice, which sees to it that everyone gets enough. Specifically in this story, everyone gets enough to eat. Remember, this is the most frequently repeated miracles of Jesus. Jesus is saying that sometimes for everyone to have enough, some of us need to have less. And therein is the resistance to this story. We all like the idea, don't we, of everyone having enough? but none of us want to have any less than we've already accumulated. Some of us may have to get by with less in order for everyone to have enough. And for a lot of Americans, we don't like that. There's a sense that in this story it sums up discipleship, an invitation to action, to involvement. Discipleship isn't just about following, but participating. And Jesus signals this promise with one pointed phrase: they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. In other words, you do it. As disciples, we often miss the participating part, don't we? We gladly follow, we gladly read our Bibles, we profess our love. But here Jesus is saying to his disciples, you do it, live already. You can't sit back, you can't watch me do everything. Live it, live life. I am counting on you because I need you. Most Bibles give the heading to this story that reads something like, Jesus feeds 5,000. When actually Jesus gives the food only to the disciples, who then feed the others. While it's clearly the miracle of Jesus that feeds the multitude, this does not reduce the call to discipleship to passive piety. Our call is to active ministry that meets human need. Jesus feeds the 12, and the 12 feed the 5,000. You know, that's the problem with miracles. We tend to get mesmerized by them, focusing on God's responsibility and forgetting our own. Miracles really let us off the hook. They appeal to the part of us that's all too happy to, let God feed the crowd. Let God save the world. Let God do it all. And if not God, then surely we expect someone else to do it. Someone else with more time, more money, someone else who's more comfortable, around those kind of people. Someone, who gets paid to do that? I had a man leave the church after I preached on this text. He was offended that I was taking the miracle away from Jesus. He was mad, and he said that people sharing what they had, that wasn't a miracle. It was just human beings being generous, sharing what they had, even though it wasn't much, even when it wasn't enough to go around. That's not a miracle, he stated. It was just a whole crowd of people moving from a sense of scarcity to a sense of plenty, overcoming their fear of going hungry, giving up their need to protect themselves. It was just a bunch of people refusing to play the age-old game of what is mine and what is yours is yours. It was just people turning their pockets inside out for one another without worrying about what was in it for them. Well, when he'd finished his rant, I asked him, "And you don't think that's a miracle?" He still left the church. Educator and author Parker Palmer was en route to a conference when the plane he was on made an unexpectedly long layover at an airport. You see, a truck that was supposed to deliver the refreshments for the next leg of the journey broke down. And finally, the pilot decided that it was more important to get the passengers on their way than to wait for the snacks. So he took off. As soon as they were in the air, the passengers started grumbling. "A ticket is a contract," one said loudly. "Snacks are part of the contract." "I ought to sue this airline," another muttered. A man stood up and said, "I'm an attorney. How many here are willing to join a class action suit?" A minor mutiny was in the works. Then something very interesting happened, Parker Palmer said. A flight attendant came on the public address system, and she began with the familiar information on such flights. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned off the seatbelt lights. We now have attained a cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. And then she said something quite extraordinary. "Having served many of you on the first leg of this flight, I know some of you still have your bag of peanuts, which you stuffed in your pocket. How many do we have? 5? Please open them and share them with the people around you. I'm sure some of you have mints, some of you have gum. Would you pass them around also? Those of you with newspapers, you can only read one section at a time. Let's spread the other sections around for others to read. Some of you are parents and grandparents. Take out those pictures of your children and grandchildren. Show them to others." And with that brief announcement, she changed the entire emotional climate of that flight. Later, when the flight attendant came near Parker Palmer's seat, he asked her, "What's your name? What's the name of your direct supervisor? I want to write a letter thanking you for what you did." That was the best example of group leadership I've ever seen in my life. To which she replied, "The loaves and fishes still work." It is, of course, true that we can't feed everyone. It's true that there will always be suffering. We can't make it go away. We can't end it forever, everywhere, forever. Jesus certainly did not feed all the people in the world, but he did try. So I wonder, and I close with this, which is actually the miracle here? For Jesus to change those few loaves into an abundance of loaves, or for Jesus to change the hearts of the people there to teach them how to share? What's the greater miracle for us? For Jesus to do all the work for us, or for Jesus to change us to enable us to do it? Amen. We thank you for joining us for worship this Sunday, and we look forward to seeing you next week. A reminder that we just thank people for continuing to give their offerings. It's very important that we continue to do that to support our church, and checks, offerings can be mailed to the church. Look for a newsletter coming up this week as well. Have a safe week.